Welcome to Close Encounters of the Holy Kind, a Lent lectionary podcast. I'm Pastor Sarah. I'm the pastor of Tibbetts UMC in West Seattle, and I'm joined here today by my friends.
Hello, I'm Charles.
Hi, I'm Rachael.
Today's episode is being recorded for Good Friday, April 7th, 2023. And I'll be reading today from the NRSV translation, the New Revised Standard Version. Rachael, what are you reading from today?
I have the Common English Bible.
Awesome. And Charles, what are you reading from today?
Sticking with the message.
Yes, awesome. The gospel reading that we've selected for today is an excerpt from the lectionary year A, Good Friday reading, Matthew 26, and we're going to read verses 47 through the end of the chapter, which is verse 75. So you're welcome to follow along with us or listen as we read this together. So Rachael, would you start us off Matthew 26, beginning at verse 47?
Absolutely. Here we go. While Jesus was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, came. With him was a large crowd carrying swords and clubs. They had been sent by the chief priests and elders of the people. His betrayer had given them a sign: "Arrest the man I kiss." Just then he came to Jesus and said, "Hello, Rabbi." Then he kissed him. But Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you came to do." Then they came and grabbed Jesus and arrested him. One of those with Jesus reached for his sword. Striking the high priest's slave, he cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put the sword back into its place. All those who use the sword will die by the sword. Or do you think that I'm not able to ask my Father and he will send to me more than 12 battle groups of angels right away? But if I did that, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that say this must happen?" Then Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me like a thief? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, but you didn't arrest me. But all this happened so that what the prophet said in the scriptures might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left Jesus and ran away.
The gang that had seized Jesus led him before Caiaphas, the chief priest, where the religion scholars and leaders had assembled. Peter followed at a safe distance until they got to the chief priest's courtyard. Then he slipped in and mingled with the servants, watching to see how things would turn out. The high priests, conspiring with the Jewish council, tried to cook up charges against Jesus in order to sentence him to death. But even though many stepped up, making up one false accusation after another, nothing was believable. Finally, 2 men came forward with this. He said, "I can tear down this temple of God and after 3 days rebuild it." The chief priest stood up and said, "What do you have to say to the accusation?" Jesus kept silent. Then the chief priest said, "I command you by the authority of the living God to say if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." Jesus was curt. "You yourself said it, and that's not all. Soon you'll see it for yourself. The Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One, arriving on the clouds of heaven." At that, the chief priest lost his temper, ripping his robes, yelling, "He blasphemed! Why do we need witnesses to accuse him? You all heard him blaspheme. Are you going to stand for such blasphemy?" They all said, "Death! That seals his death sentence." Then they were spitting in his face and knocking him around. They jeered as they slapped him. "Prophecy, Messiah, who hit you that time?"
Now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But Peter denied it before all of them, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." When he was out on the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, Peter denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." Then Peter began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." At that moment, the cock crowed. Then Peter remembered what Jesus had said, Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Oh boy. Okay. Well, we are we're in Good Friday. We are in the darkness, in the valley of the shadow of death here. So much going on here, and this isn't even the whole lectionary selection, but tell me what came up for you as we were reading this, questions, insights, reflections.
I struck immediately by the tenderness of kissing somebody to betray them. Like that's like one of the most iconic things of all time, right? And Jesus in the message says, "Friend, why this charade?" And I think about all the times in my life where I've been like, I don't know, like I can't help but empathize with Judas, because it's like, did you like, growing up hearing about this, like my parents are like, well, Judas, like was destined to do this and like all this stuff. So I'm like, this person was just born to like screw Jesus over and be like the most hated person and like that. Like I can't buy into that. But just this thought of like when people can see through you, the people that you're close with, right? Like they know, like you're putting this front up, like I'm not going to press into you, but I don't know. Like to me, there's this Jesus being able to see, and I guess Jesus knew what was coming, but I mean, like you don't show up with like people with clubs and like swords, right? But just I think first off is that tenderness of a kiss, that and knowing it was coming, but also calling out like, why you don't have to like pretend to like me or whatever anymore, like it's done. Yeah, it's like Jesus taking some kind of agency, like you can't, like I already know it's coming, so you don't have to kiss my ass to like I don't know. Rachel, do you have anything? I'm just kind of like
I love that you brought that up, Charles. That I'm thinking of a tweet that I wish I could remember who tweeted it. I saw it sometime in the last couple of years around this very encounter between Jesus and Judas, and it essentially made the point of how someone's public affection for Jesus does not tell the whole story. So the ways in which we invoke the name of Jesus and invoke faith as our reason for doing things that are actually very thinly veiled as loving but are extremely hateful, right? Like or hate the sin, love the sinner type mentality of, even just thinking of like these laws in Tennessee and all around the country, these bills that are targeting trans people, particularly children, and the art of drag, and and it's supposedly like to protect children, and yet it's extremely harmful and dangerous and life-threatening to young people, but it's the ways in which we, can invoke, not only faith, but the name of Jesus, and publicly appear to be very, very loving and well-intended, and yet right there is the betrayal, Charles. Like when you pointed out, you don't bring people with clubs unless something sinister is about to happen, right? So when all the while you're surrounded by people who are there to do violence, like I'm struck by that. So I'm glad you brought that up, because I had forgotten that tweet, and I'm sorry to whoever tweeted that I don't remember who it was, so I can't cite you properly, but yeah.
That's good. Yeah, this betrayal, and we sort of get it in 2 places here, like both with Judas and Peter. And I guess I've always felt like Peter's betrayal in denying Jesus is worse than Judas. And maybe that's because like Peter and Jesus were super tight, and Jesus, told Peter like, you're going to be the rock of my church and all of that. And as you mentioned, Charles, like Jesus kind of always knew that Judas was going to throw him under the bus. But it is interesting. If we were to keep reading, we would, of course, find that when Judas realizes the magnitude and impact of his actions, he is beside himself. And he kills himself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty dark. And that for me just begs like, okay, why Judas? Like, what did you think was going to happen? Truly, like, I don't know. I can't believe the scripture implies that he did it for the money, but his actions after the fact, I think, seem to illustrate that he didn't really fully understand what he was doing. And maybe that's what greed does to you. Like maybe it just like blinds you to the point where you don't realize until it's too late. But yeah, it's this betrayal is so human. It's so human, and we see that everywhere in our world right now. Yeah, just the betrayal of like us. I'm thinking right now about our elected leaders and the promises that are made and what they say they're going to do versus what is actually done. Which,
You're
yeah, go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
No, that's it. That's all I have to
No,
say.
your mention of Peter, like the comparing the two betrayals, right? And for me, I don't know. I always thought like Peter was it was like he's stressed out, he's tired. Like I thought he was in some kind of like trance state. Like, I don't know what it was in my mind. I approached it from this like strange, like he's under a spell, like this is something happening
Mhm.
because it like immediately is like lifted by the rooster crowing, right? Like it seems a very like magical thing in this text, in my opinion. That's like what I approach, and and so I can't help, like did something happen in his mind to protect him? Like it was like we're in fight or flight mode, like it shuts down. Like I don't know, like I'm trying to
Yeah.
humanize him a bit more, and I think not that you were, throwing him under the bus, but
Mhm.
just that yeah, that I don't know. It's just this whole ending to the story to me is just very symbolic, and maybe it's because I saw The Passion of the Christ when I was in high school, and that like movie was like burned into
Yeah.
the memories of my brain. But yeah, the part with Peter, and uh, not to jump around too much, but the part where someone grabs a sword and cuts off the chief priest's servant's
Yeah.
ear. And in the movie, Jesus, puts the ear back and heals it. And maybe that's talked about in another passage, but um, it's just like all of a sudden, not that the Bible hasn't been brutal and violent, it has really dark things, but it's like lots of dark stuff is happening all at once. Violence, bodily harm, suicide.
Yeah.
And it's a lot to digest from these wonderful stories we've been talking about where Jesus, meets the woman at the well, heals the man that was born blind. Um,
Well, and there's been like a build up to it. And now
mhm.
it's like, I mean, you could kind of feel the pressure intensifying, in last week's text when they almost stone Jesus. Like we get the first sort of inkling of the violent acts about to take place. But yeah, I think Peter, as you were speaking, Charles, I was reflecting, um, was in like the heat of the moment, and having just saw Jesus get the shit beat out of him was probably like, oh, maybe he wasn't even thinking, like maybe it was just his fight or flight response, not trying to just like let Peter off the hook. But I think, maybe in that moment he was like, okay, well, I don't want to end up that way. Like what hope does the movement have, and two, like I like my life and I don't want to die. So yeah, I like to think that when I'm in hot water, I would like do the right thing and have a spine. But if somebody was, about to throw a rock at my face, I might not, right? Just to preserve my
Yeah.
own life and safety.
And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if Peter hadn't denied him.
Mhm.
Would he have been brought before them, and then Peter would be like, well, here's everybody else, that was at this parade, like,
Right.
and what would have happened? We don't know, but just interesting to think about if Peter had been like, yeah, it's me, and then here's everybody else, and then everybody else stood up with Jesus, like, um would as we know what happens, would it have happened as we know it happened? I don't know. Like, it's, again, so much like what ifs, like if this had been different, if Judas hadn't done this in the first place, would Jesus, well, it's like, I think, maybe it's for Easter what I'm thinking, but
Don't go there. Don't go there. We're still
yeah.
in the yeah. Mm.
It's interesting, I mean, comparing the two, listening to both of you reflect on sort of, um, playing with this idea of like kind of comparing Judas and Peter and the different roles that they play and how this unfolds. Judas plays such an explicit role, like he sets this all into motion. So yeah, it's really easy to point to him and hold up his name as the betrayer, the one, the first one who kind of flipped loyalties and sold out. And yeah, without him starting this off, would this all have happened? Wouldn't happened. And so thinking about Peter and listening to you, Charles, talk about how he was sort of like in a trance almost and not himself, that really spoke to me. Like thinking of, when we are kind of bystanders, like Peter's being more complicit than Judas. Judas was like explicitly, sort of setting this all in motion, as I already kind of said. But Peter, it's like when you're watching something unfold in front of you, it's so easy not to step in. It's so easy to just um, sort of tell yourself, maybe it's not that bad. Surely this can't be happening. Like maybe he was like dissociating, like you said, Charles, just sort of like happy thoughts, happy place, or like this can't be real. I'm not really seeing this. Like, and then also thinking about what you just said as well as like if he had stood up, would other people have joined him, and would it have started sort of a turn of the tide in this moment? And I wonder if there's an element too of like Peter not just being fearful of his own for his own safety, but also like, well, what can I possibly do? Like wondering if his single voice could make a difference. Like if he's thinking that no one would stand with him, that no one, that he would be the only one to speak on Jesus's behalf. Like thinking about the ways in which we can tell ourselves so easily, well, if I were to speak up, what difference am I going to make against these extreme forces of power and principalities? And if I were to say something, what difference would it make anyway? So, yeah, those are just some thoughts that are coming to mind.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
And going back to a few verses back when Jesus is before the chief priest, to me it's like they'd already made up their minds. They were just like prodding at him to get him to say something that would be like, oh, you said it, now I got to tear my clothes off and be angry. But like it was just like, this is gonna happen whether you want it to or not. Let's just like get some extra stuff like to fuel the fire. Yeah. And so Rachel, I love that illusion of Peter, dissociating, and I don't know. And it's like, I can't help but have compassion for Judas, like, obviously I don't want to be the Judas in anybody's life, like the person, that betrays or like hurts their friend. But it's like, I know in some ways throughout my life, I have betrayed my friends, whether it's minimal or whatever level, but
Sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Something
I
you
think
said
I'm
just like
rambling.
sparked something for me. I
Yeah.
had like a light bulb moment. It's not only like them betraying Jesus, but I think because of who Jesus is, it's also like them betraying themselves,
Yes.
like Christ has called me, Christ has called us, Judas and Peter, into this partnership and kinship and community and way of life. And in these two instances, you know, they are like going another way. I mean, they have walked off the path, you know, like are lost in the forest now kind of thing. And that, I mean, I'm always struck every year how, you know, the celebration of Palm Sunday, and then how quickly the crowd turns on Jesus. Because that, like, where was that animosity towards Jesus on Palm Sunday? And, you know, Palm Sunday, as Jesus is ushered into Jerusalem, you know, the feeling is one of hope. Like, there's hope for us. And hope also means change. It means having skin in the game. It means something is expected of you. And I've certainly felt like I've gotten to many points in my own, you know, discipleship and ministry where I felt like, wow, okay, this is, I actually don't know if I want to do this, if I want to go through with this, if I want to follow through, right? Like, I really want to follow and be faithful, God, but what you're asking me to do is all the things I hate. Being confrontational, dealing with people who disagree or, you know, aren't excited about whatever's happening in the church or ministry or whatever the thing is. But yeah, I think that this story is so relatable and is such an incredible like self-reflection tool for us to think about our own life and involvement in following Jesus, and then how we turn our backs, you know. Yeah, on God and each other, like, and ourselves.
So good.
Yeah.
I'm noticing a detail while you're talking, Sarah. It's sort of bringing to light this multiple exchanges that Peter has. And I'm just noticing for the first time the detail of that it's two like servant women. He's not being, I don't know what's there. I'm just kind of thinking through this. Like,
Well, he's not being
it's
called
not
out
someone who's like threatening him.
Yeah.
You know, it's like when you think of power and status as at that time, and you know, like Jesus's exchange with the Samaritan woman at the well, it was like unheard of that a woman was talking to a man alone, and she was a Samaritan. That was a whole other thing as well. But you know, just thinking of like, it's what if it was someone who, I don't know, like what if they had heard of Jesus and were like interested in what he had to say,
Interesting.
and needing some, and like, wait, you were with him, right? Like in an excited and eager way, or like, yeah, they're not people who were threatening him. They're not the people with the clubs, right? And so talking about like, yeah, Peter was understandably, of course, afraid of it for his own safety. But I'm just kind of picking out those details of like, but it was two people who very much not threatening, which is fascinating to me. So anyway,
yeah. Well, and maybe, I mean, I think that happens too, where sometimes you perceive a threat that maybe isn't there, you know, like out of your own fear, right? Of like, I don't know. You know, we hosted a drag show in our fellowship hall, and literally yesterday. So that's so cool. But we got a handful of these negative emails, which I think we talked about a little bit in our last episode recording. But, you know, I had a couple days where I was just so distraught, like nauseous, sick to my stomach over this handful of emails of people saying what you're doing is not of God, you know, and raking us over the coals. And I'm so glad that I felt that grief, because then it put me in a place where I could really stand in the joy of the day. But at the time, I really did perceive that as a threat, and as a, you know, not that I questioned whether or not we were doing the right thing, but I questioned my own strength and courage to follow through. facing that criticism. But, went to the Lord in prayer on my knees, literally, like, please, God, take this cup from me because we are doing this thing. And of course, God did what God does, which was reveal that, that threat was whatever meaning I allowed it to have. you know, So yeah, I wonder if that might be part of what's going on here too. Obviously, I'm projecting onto Peter right now. I'll just own it. But that too of like, oh my gosh, if these people are asking like, will they out me? Will they tell on me? Will they,
Ooh,
will
will they
they,
out me?
yeah, will they out me? Yeah. Mm, mm. Yeah, gosh, this just gets like so heavy. I mean, it truly is like God's drama and incredible storytelling, but it just gets so heavy so fast. And then there's like, we didn't read this, but I think it's worth talking about. Later on in chapter 27, Pilate questions Jesus and then, says to the crowd, we release happy Passover, we release a thief today. Like what is that? It's verse 27:15. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. And so, he says, do you want me to release Barabbas or Jesus? And so when they say Barabbas, which is like, it was just kind of wild. It almost seems like it's a sport, right? Like it almost just feels like it's the sport, like killing Jesus is like an act of entertainment or something, which is very messed up.
Mhm.
Very messed up.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
no, I'm thinking about something I was reading recently, but I was like, oh yeah, that's like people went to executions with their children like
Yes.
all the time, and obviously that's very hard for me to wrap my mind around now. But I went down like this rabbit hole of something that was condemned. Someone killed people, like they broke in and killed people, and like they had their bodies like just horrific violence done to people in public, and people were cheering for it, and rallying around that. And it's almost so it is like so hard to be like in this mindset of like, this is what happens every year. Like they release a prisoner, we get to go watch other people get brutally murdered, tortured. Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that, but I think there's so much of like, people are so desensitized now, and it's like people
Yes.
have always been,
Yep.
in a lot of ways, bloodthirsty for seeing, they deserve that punishment, so we need to make sure that we, see it, and it happens to them.
Yeah.
And there's something about that to wrestle with, right? Like we as humans usually want to see people who have done wrong punished for what they've done, whether that's a brutal execution like the crucifixion, or they're going to prison for life or whatever. And I think there's that mob mentality, that frenzy to get caught up into, like Sarah, you're talking about, when everybody was so hopeful when Jesus came in, and then in a matter of days it shifted. And then they released Barabbas, who in the Message they call him the infamous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I think about time, events in my life where I've seen things that people have done, that we've all seen things people have done that are horrific, and to think about like, yes, let's release this person back into society, and as opposed to this other person who is bringing hopeful. And again, I'm just like struck by this, like, what was in the water that week, like that everybody was like, yeah, this seems like a great idea. Not this guy, but also that mentality of capital punishment, of like, this is just the norm, like we are going to execute people. And obviously I don't know what that felt like to live in that time, what my body would have like been responding to. And you know, Sarah, when you said they outed them, like obviously that was like alarms, because you know, I spent so much of my life terrified of being outed as a gay person and what that would mean and what that would look like. And I think of Jesus has been repeatedly coming out as, you know, like, I'm here, like it's hopeful. And
Mm-hmm.
and now it's like, and now this is the consequence of, not for everybody, but like, this is what's going to happen to Jesus in his story. And I guess I keep hitting my head up against that wall of the evangelical message of Jesus had to die for you.
Yes.
You know, and again, that's like kind of where I was like, is this too much Easter? Is it still Good Friday? But that leading up to Jesus has come out as this hopeful person who says, like, I'm the Christ and so are you, and we all have this together, and we can build a better life together outside of these systems of oppression. And it's like, people are just like, no, like, that's too outside of the box, we got to shut that up. And how many times I have shut up that like voice of the Christ in me because I've been too scared of what
Right.
other people are going to think. Am I getting in trouble? Am I going to get smacked down for this? Obviously not, thankfully, as drastic as crucifixion, but I mean, realistically, how many times do we crucify that part of ourselves that's saying there is hope, there is a better way, there is a different way of being in this world, and we can do this together? And it's like, are you crazy? Like,
Right.
no. I don't know. There's something there that is so relatable to me, of like a taste of hope, but then there's a fear and it comes in and it just kind of tries to extinguish that flame of hope. And I just want to like put my hands around that little flame and go, you know, like,
Yeah.
build
Yeah.
that fire
Look
back
the
up again.
fire. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Rachel, I'm waiting for you to talk about atonement theology.
Oh yeah.
Do it.
You just like teed me up. I'm ready.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, Charles, I could listen to you forever. I love everything you just said. Yeah. And, what was coming to mind was the incredible work of the late, great theologian, Dr. James Cone, wonderful liberation theologian, who wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he draws these comparisons to the horrific history and frankly present of the lynching of Black Americans. And so when you're talking about just this mob mentality and doing it for sport and bringing your children, and the ways in which our society celebrates ugly violence, I think that's something that the power of this particular story, or part of the story of Jesus's life, his death, um, it reveals so much about just the hideousness that human beings are capable of. And I think there's such power in, throughout Lent, right? Like, we are in this time of self-examination, and I think it kind of all comes to a head right here, when we look at this just complete and utter violence, and ways in which we are not only complicit in it, but it's been enacted throughout our history as a first country, and then as a world as well. And I'm also intrigued by, so the question of, at the very beginning of the passage that we read aloud together, of the all this happened so that the scriptures could be fulfilled, all of that. So, like, this question, did this have to happen, and why? And was this God's plan all along to save humanity? That, God just came down, put on a like little human suit, went through the motions, and then that's what it took to atone
Yeah.
for our sins. Like, I don't believe that.
I can't buy it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then another thing that came to mind, this is my Good Friday nerd now, teed up and ready to go. One of my favorite quotes that I've ever heard or read is from the author. His name is Mike McHarg, Science Mike. He had a podcast called Science Mike for a while. Yeah. I think it's from one of his books, but he says this thing that I'm going to paraphrase it, like that the cross was not God's invention, it was ours. Like, we cried out for blood, we cried out for violence, and of one another, and then God offered God's own instead, and this like lack of resistance that we see from Jesus is always striking as well. Like, from the beginning, when they chop off the slave's ear that you pointed out, Charles, like that people were going like, okay, let's fight, let's fight back, and Jesus says no, like, let's just let this unfold. And then he's silent before he rejects the premise of their questions. They're trying, as we've seen throughout the Gospels, they try to catch him with words and get him to kind of trip himself up and incriminate himself. And Jesus, ever the wordsmith and genius of, rejects the very premise of their questions and questioning. And I just think it's extremely powerful. So my answer to the question of like, did Jesus have to die to save humanity?
Wait, can I throw a part 2 in there?
Of course.
I like what you said about like the cross was not God's invention. So the question that came to mind then was, so if Jesus like didn't die to atone our sins, then why did Jesus die? And yeah, so that's part 2. Because I'm with you, but then it's like, but then why? Right.
So my thought process with this, it like, because our world is so messed up, because we have so much brokenness and sinfulness, sin in the very meaning of the word, right, of missing the mark, what the word sin means, that when God's self shows up on this earth in the most loving ways, we had built such a world. I'm not articulating this particularly well, but we had built such a world that it was not compatible with God being among us. That's how far we had gone. So of course, that love, that radical justice and inclusion, of course it came to this, because it was always going to come to this, because God amongst us was not sustainable because we were too messed up, basically, to put it in a short. So I don't think it was part of like God's plan to atone for humanity, but I think it unveiled the depth of how far gone we were. And I'm going to do the little wink wink to Easter.
Like, let's go there for a second, because that matters.
And exactly. And death did not have the last word even then. So like, in the resurrection, in the conquering of death, in the rejection of our rejection, right? Like, God was like, no.
Well, yeah, you can't, you can literally like kill God and God will bounce back, basically. Yes. Right? Like,
that's it.
Yeah. And that also then says, like, illustrates God's love, is that like, even when you reject me to the point of wanting and actually crucifying me, I will still show up for you, because that is love.
Yeah.
Now, sorry, Charles, I'm stealing your lines, because that's you're the love hype.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, people are so focused on the crucifixion, like clinging to the old rugged cross. Like, no, that's not Jesus's message. Jesus's message is atonement, at one-ment. Like, we are one with God. Like, we are that love. And even if you try to destroy the body that like that's just a symbol for like that was its love's communication device at this time, was this body. And you can't extinguish that. Like I think about that a lot, like what am I, like as this consciousness right now, what am I? Am I this body? Am I this person with these store, like what am I? And it's like I think Jesus was like, Sarah, to your question of like, did Jesus have to die, or like why did Jesus die? And I was like, it was because he was preaching liberation in an oppressive society, and that was that's why it happened.
it.
But also like and it was, that's why it happened, but it also was showing people like, you are not this projection of this body, like you are love because I created you as myself. And Jesus was just awake in that fact and that understanding and connected to what all of us are. And again, I think it goes back to how much we put up as a block to that love. And when it, we're afraid of that, I think we are so, in my experience, I've been so like, we're all sinners saved by grace. And even in the Bible, it says we are the righteousness of God, like, all this stuff. And it's like, we're so afraid to look inside of ourselves, because there are these parts that might be ugly or might be hateful. And Jesus is like, that's not you. You are pure love. And so am I. And I'm still here, even though you kill this body, you brutalize it. Okay. Like, and I think another thing that has always stuck out to me is, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. And I always, for a long time, I was stuck on the fact, like, they don't know, like, that they're brutalizing the Son of God. And it was like, no, they have believed so strongly in these stories and like built this identity for themselves that they don't know what they're doing, because they are believing they are something else other than the Christ themselves too. And so I think going through this story, I am like, this is really dark and there is some sad stuff, because I'm like, well, where's Judas? Like, Judas hung himself. But like, I can't say like Judas was burning in hell, because I don't believe in hell, but also like, I don't think that Judas was just another face or persona that love put on, and I think that whole message of, again, the atonement is, there's nothing like, you can keep believing these stories, but there's nothing that you have ever done that could separate you from the love of God, no matter what religion you believe in, or if you're an atheist, like nothing can ever take that away. And I think it's Good Friday. It's good for a reason, right? Like, what's the good of it?
Yes.
So
Well,
yeah,
sorry, I
that.
want to comment on something you said.
Yeah, please go. I love your nails, by the way.
Thank you. Sparkly purple Easter nails, Palm Sunday Easter. Maybe I'll wear like black lipstick for Good Friday or something.
Goth, complete goth.
Yeah, yes, goth. Well, you were talking about, Charles, when you like, look within yourself and find love, but then you also find like your shadow selves and, like the things about you that like, might be ugly. And you said, God tells us like, that's not you. And I've been thinking about this a lot, because as we look at our own unconscious bias and, like white privilege and sort of entrenchment in the, in white supremacy, and like constantly untangling ourselves from that. And that's just one example of, part of what lurks in the shadows of our hearts, right? But thinking about that and doing that internal work, like part of, for me, this narrative of Jesus journey to Jerusalem, and then like all of these events, Palm Sunday leading up to his murder, is sort of illustrating what I think for us is like, go to those places, like walk into those shadows and examine that part of yourself. And in doing so, like, let God's light shine on those parts of yourself too,
Yes.
which then exposes them. Because once it's exposed, like once you can name aloud, you know, like, I'm racist, right? Like once you can name those things, then you can begin to unpack them and be freed from them. But you know, I think that, I mean, I was one of those people for a long time that was like, well, I'm not racist. I'm not racist. I'm not racist. You know, I couldn't possibly be racist, right? Like, and you know, constantly coming to the defense rather than looking within my heart and saying, okay, what's lurking beneath the shadows, and can I step into them unafraid to examine what's there? And the answer is yes, I can, because I believe in the risen Christ, right? Within me, also abiding in my heart, you know? Yeah. So I think there's something in that too, just facing it. And that's what Jesus does. I mean, he faces, we didn't read, you know, when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he, at the beginning of chapter 26, of course, now I can't find it. Oh, it's not the beginning. It's like the first quarter. But yeah, you know, he's just like beside himself. Oh, here we go. 26:42. Jesus went away for the second time and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done." And just that, you know, level of like grief that Jesus and weight that Jesus is carrying too, of, okay, this is what, this is where we're headed. And yeah, let your will be done, God, even though this is not where I want to go, you know? Yeah, that was more long-winded than I anticipated, but
No, that looking within. And I think that to me, when you were talking about that, like the more we're fearing something about ourselves, like we give it the power to hurt us or to control us, right? And
or to become an idol even, you know?
Yeah. I was just looking at this part that you were just mentioning about Jesus, like, and he said, "My Father, if there's any way, get me out of this, but please, not what I want. What do you want?" And
If there's any way, get me out of this.
yeah, you know, and it's like,
So good.
if Jesus knew, like, you know, like this isn't the end, like obviously I'm gonna be back to and it's like, is this included so we can find Jesus more relatable? You know, like, even if I knew in however many hours, you know, like I'm gonna be back or whatever, it's just like, I don't want to do something uncomfortable. I don't want to face this part. Like, I don't want to have to go through this discomfort.
Which, yes, I feel that all the time, so hard, especially when I'm being faithful to what God is calling me to do. Especially. That is how I felt when we started to receive some negative feedback from the outside community about the drag show, of just like, oh God, I don't want to do this. You know, I don't want to face this. I don't want to navigate this. I don't want to. And you know what? It's interesting because my gut reaction to reading this feedback was to defend myself and to defend our church for why we were doing this. And then in the days that followed, in my prayer and reflection and conversation with other community members, like my heart really softened, and I actually got to the place where I was like, actually, I don't think defending us is what God wants us to do, because I think what we're doing speaks for itself. And, you know, God's the one that will change hearts and minds, and all we can do is extend the invitation, you know?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. You know, that.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Powerful. Yeah. Mm.
That God, changing hearts
Mm.
and minds, and what we do speaks for itself. Letting us be love and embody love and give space for people to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to express themselves creatively, and for people to see that and go, wow, this person's doing this, maybe I could do that someday. Or and I think it's so easy to want to control, and like I always think of like contract, like I just contract when I'm like, no, like I can't do that. And um also personally, like how many times I've prayed maybe my parents will change their mind about queer people, like
Yeah.
um but realizing like that's not what God has called me to do. God has just said love, your neighbor as yourself, and love, but and love being God. But I and there's such freedom in that. Like I don't
Yeah.
have to try to do this. I don't have to defend this.
Mm-hmm.
And Rachel, like when you mentioned Jesus, like not fighting back, like even though people came with like clubs and swords, like, and Jesus wasn't like, yeah, let's have a sword fight before I go off to
Right.
prison.
Yeah.
And I think, when you start defending yourself, it's because you really believe like you can suffer from harm from whatever you're perceiving as, antagonistic towards you. And there's just that beauty of I don't know, like with this whole thing of Jesus, like, what do you want? And I think when I read that just now, I thought about this meditation I've done where it's like, put your hands on your heart and say, not my will, but your will, like speaking to that, like that self in you and connecting to that heart space. And realizing that like love's will, if God is love, like that's the best of the best. That's what we could only, ever hope for, no matter what we've been projecting onto it, or our situations. So, whew, man, this is heavy stuff.
And that just to sort of, I don't know, turn to the heaviest of it for a moment, looking ahead at chapter, 27, starting around 32, like when actually 27 is when he's being mocked and stripped and beaten, and after that he's nailed to the cross and is suffering on the cross and crying out to God, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mine says, why have you left me, in the Common English, actually. I think so much of this, it's hard to read, and yet it's also, I don't know, the words like divine empathy are coming to mind. Like, my God died. My God knows the pain of death. Like, my God has felt every pain, was humiliated, was beaten. I'm starting to sound very um, some type of way. But like that to me just has such power, because life is hard. Life is full of grief. Life is full of loss. Like, we experience these things, we know these things, and the most vulnerable in our world know these things, far more than someone of immense privilege like myself does. And, but I think there's just, I mean, reading this in your holy text, like seeing the deepest pain that someone might experience, laid out, and then right, and then of of Easter, there's no, it's just unflinchingly honest, I guess, is sort of um my thought here. But yeah, like there's this like divine, like Jesus was fully human, like fully God and fully human, and knew every human experience, like down to death, in the most torturous way. That I don't know if I'm making sense, but like there's just this,
Yeah.
my God knew what it was to suffer. Like that has such power. Like,
It really does.
um,
It really does. Mm.
I love Good Friday.
Yeah. Oh, any other Good Friday thoughts for us here as we sort of come to the end of our hour together? Yeah, it really does kind of feel like whiplash, going from Palm Sunday to this, especially in like this current context where, you know, Tibbetts just hosted this drag event as an act of repentance and as a way to center and affirm LGBTQIA plus voices. And it was such a joyful and incredible day. And actually, listeners, Palm Sunday, April 1st, you're already on our YouTube channel if you're listening to this. Watch the service because Miss Pentecost, drag queen, stepped into the pulpit and preached an amazing sermon. The whole service was phenomenal. But yeah, just to be, I mean, I feel like that was like the highest highs. Like we stood on the mountaintop today and looked out at, you know, the goodness and beauty of God's creation. And now here we are in the depths of despair, facing the ugliest parts of ourselves and our human condition. And then, of course, thinking about why would God want to become human? Like, why did God do this? And yeah, it's just profound. I love theology. I love Christian theology. I love scripture. I'm so glad there are other people in the world that also enjoy this, like the two of you. And we're not the only ones. And you, who's ever listening.
YouTube
Welcome
in
to
like
the party.
20 years.
Yes. Okay. Do we have anything else? Anything else we want to add?
I'm
No.
good.
I'm thinking things that I think are better suited for next time. I'm sort of
Save
like,
it.
I'm
Save
reading
it.
the end of 27 and like the jumping off point of
Yes.
the
Yeah.
tail end of the burial in the tomb, and then to be continued.
So to be clear, at the end of this recording, Jesus is dead. So Jesus is now dead, just to be clear. And now we're going to sit with that. Please email us your thoughts, questions. Email is listed below the video, your reflections. Like this, subscribe to our channel, and tune in for the final episode of this iteration of Close Encounters of the Holy Kind for our Easter recording.
Yeah, you have to stick around to see what happens.
Yeah.
Yes. What happened?
Mystery.
Jesus
big
is
mystery.
dead.
Yep,
Jesus is dead.
Yeah.
Gotta...
Yeah. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much. Rachel, Charles, always a joy and pleasure. Yeah, great conversation. I can't wait to mull it over as I prepare a sermon.
Sounds good.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.